Hello and welcome to VHTB, your guide to the talent, culture, and capital forces shaping the hard tech ecosystem. My name is Justice Killian. I'm a partner at Space Capital. We provide high conviction capital for founders that are transforming the real world. Today, I'm joined by Brian Major of Ad Astra Talent Advisors. How are you, Brian?
Doing fantastic. Looking forward to getting into these topics.
Yeah, good to see you. And Matt Jertson of Built. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
Great to see you, Justice. I'm doing really good. Trying not to get too hot in my basement recording studio while it's 95 degrees outside.
Well, it's been a minute since we've come together, and I'm excited to chat today. There is a tremendous amount of activity happening over the summer, a lot of big rounds closing, a lot of attention on hard tech, a lot of investor interest. The SpaceX IPO is a perfect example, drew a ton of attention to space and, all that enables. Saronic raised a very large round, nearly $2 billion. True Anomalies closed a massive round, Impulse Space. There's a lot of attention on hard tech right now, and there's a lot of dollars flying around. And so today, what I was really hoping to unpack and sort of chat through with you guys is, what are we seeing as the state of hard tech right now, and the biggest gaps and potential risks that are starting to emerge given the state of the market? And so, I threw out a couple large rounds that are clearly, showing that capital is flowing in one direction. I'm curious, what comes to mind when I sort of throw this out there for you guys?
I think for me, the biggest thing that comes up is almost kind of cultural. When translating what we're trying to do and what hard tech companies in general are trying to do into message that the more general audience, the more general public accepts and gets excited about. There's a reason why, there's lots of reasons why, but at least one of the reasons why building things, hard tech got a bad name decades ago is because there was a lot, like it's something that's happening in the physical world versus different from software. And it often means like you're gonna, if you're building a building somewhere, there was something there before. And maybe the person that was there before is mad that you're putting in this new building, or you're building a highway, or you're building whatever it is, or you're using up energy. And I think AI is actually the perfect example today of where, in my mind, this went wrong, is the messaging around AI and what the impact it was going to have and how it was going to shape the world basically made it so that if AI goes well, it takes all our energy, water, and everyone loses their job, or what? Like the good case seemed really bad, and so everybody was against it, and everybody said, "Don't." You got New York banning data centers, and I think that's just one of the things that's very different from the software world. Is the software you can just do so much without impacting the lived experiences of a lot of people, whereas in the hardware space, like it's just in our physical reality. And so being able to explain the benefits and what you're hoping to achieve to a general audience becomes just a lot more important. And I think that risk there, again, another example of, and I'm going on here, but like with the SpaceX IPO, it's like there's clearly been this transition where now there's a lot of people who are invested in or doing things with or talking about SpaceX who aren't themselves interested in space. And so just it changes the dynamic of how you talk about it.
Yeah, I think the properties of scaling hardware are much more present in our day-to-day lives, and the inputs, that are feeding that and the trade-offs that come from it are very real. Yeah. And it's showing up in a pronounced way. AI is a great example of that. Brian, what comes to mind when you're at the intersection of, some very important hard tech that's being built? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think what we see the most in our work helping to build a lot of these early stage teams is these rounds are bigger. They're coming more easily and more quickly. And so you just have more companies trying to scale very rapidly all at the same time. And so there definitely is this sense of urgency to hire quickly and to grow your team very quickly and also expand your physical space more quickly. There's a lot of people moving in, acquiring or leasing new buildings and expanding into larger and larger spaces and trying to solve problems of like, how do I keep engineering and production tied closely to each other while also doubling and tripling my team and building very large hardware that's hard to move around. And so you have a lot of these companies raising these large rounds who are now sitting on a huge pile of cash, and it creates this extra sense of urgency to do something with it and to do something effectively with it. It's easier said than done, and especially when that's what everyone is also trying to do. There's a lot of competition for the people in the physical spaces as well.
Yeah, I think we've touched on this a little bit in the past, but the venture ecosystem really is something that I didn't fully appreciate when I got into this game, is how cyclical this industry is. And it really does follow these like waves of capital becomes much more abundant and easy. That means larger rounds into companies. When capital is easier to access and there's more money on, these companies' balance sheets, then they're spending more, to build roughly the same amount of traction, same amount of milestones. And so that capital's chasing, more talent, often very scarce talent that's hard to get. So, you're bidding up the prices of salaries. You're, chasing that with larger equity comp packages. The physical real estate that you need, like we were saying on the hard tech side, to be able to build and scale. Now there's less options for where you can actually go and get the square footage that you need to be able to do it. So you have more companies competing for that. So you get this sort of like almost like inflationary spike that isn't really translating into built value for the end customers that you're serving.
Yeah.
But a lot of money is being spent. And, it just reminds me of multiple conversations that we've had in the past around the value of a scarcity mindset and a disciplining function that it creates in leadership. And what comes from that scarcity mentality is often creativity and innovation that forces, people to do more with less and think outside of the box and really listen to the end customer and make sure that you're serving a market need before dumping a lot of capital into a problem set.
Yeah, you touched on a couple of really interesting things there. And I think part of what's happening here, and again, tying it back to like what Matt was saying with software too, is historically hardware was so hard because not only did you have to pay for people, you also had to pay more for physical spaces and more for the hardware. And so your human capital costs in hardware are like a lot smaller percentage of your costs compared to a software company where you don't have as much of those same needs. And so your human capital costs are a lot higher. And so generally people like paid a lot more in software. And so that like constricted things in the hardware world. But now that there's so much cash going into hardware, you're ending up kind of with like that same logic almost working against itself, where like founders are looking at their budgets and saying, I have this cash and I have to save a lot of my cash for hardware and physical spaces. The human cost is actually relatively low. I may as well hire more humans and pay them more so that I can go do the things quickly because it doesn't eat away at my budget as much as the other stuff. And so I think that is resulting in some of this inflationary, like higher salaries and some of these other things happening. And it makes sense. And I don't know that one is right or wrong, but it's a very interesting trend because like you said, the scarcity isn't really there. And so the creativity is less, how do I do more with less money? And it's more like, how do I do more quickly? How do I keep the quality high and the speed high, knowing I'm not resource constrained? And so it's just like a very different problem set that I think these founders have versus what they had when resources were a bit more constrained.
I like that framing because it is sort of an interesting leadership, question that I really don't think that a founder, given the option to take the same amount of dilution in their company for $5 million or $15 million, would say, hey, I'm just going to take that scarce option because it may make us smarter or more creative or, grind harder. And so it's almost like a false reality to say that like, you have that choice, the incentives are there. You will take the greater amount of capital. And as a result, it shifts sort of the leadership dynamic from a world of scarcity and some of the incentives that creates to this reality of build faster, do more, execute at greater velocity. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, Matt, do you have any thoughts on like leading through those type of decisions that what that could look like and how that translates into the culture of an organization that is both strong and also a risk?
Yeah, I think it always is. It always comes back to the culture and whether or not you set a clear kind of decision tree and good examples where you really, I worked at a company where part of onboarding was the CFO came and briefed everybody and gave a really great example of just like, how we thought about spending money, and that it wasn't about finding the cheapest thing. It was about starting with the cheapest thing. And, at least in terms of what you were looking at purchasing, and then having reasons to make it more expensive, right? And so and that's and that was just part of then instituting this culture of what you're doing. There's a friend of mine from SpaceX who's now founded a couple companies, and I had him on my other podcast once, and he said he wished he could just, if there was one thing he wants to have in their factory, and it's just up on the wall, he wants to have a running clock of cash on hand, so that everybody in the company can see how much money we have. And it was almost like when he was talking about, making firing decisions or, deciding, oh, I can't give you any more time. It was all, all things being equal, like people are going to solve problems. But the question is, can you solve the problem fast enough given how much runway we have kind of, and having those different discussions. So the thing I wanted to ask you, Justice, or you, Brian, either is, the thing that's interesting about that is I do think right now we're in a period where so many people that they're on their second or third startup right now, or they grew up in a company that was either successful or not. And we've been through a few busts. I feel like these cycles are going pretty quickly right now for various reasons. When it comes back to the original question of gaps and risks, are you seeing it practically like are founders and founding teams like seeing this as a risk and knowing like, oh, like no matter what the money is doing right now, like I need to be prepared? Or is there a legitimate gap in the mindset of some of the leaders that you're seeing out there, you think, in the marketplace?
That's a great question. I mean, I could say from companies that are a little bit more seasoned, raising like their Series C, D rounds, they are aware of the cyclical nature of the industry. And so they're raising capital while it's plentiful in anticipation of a drought, right? And so how do we have at least 3 years of cash on hand? Because at some point, who knows when, this is going to be a lot harder to raise and therefore more expensive. And we don't want to get, caught with, a limited amount of runway in the bank. And so, you have rounds that are being raised. People aren't even announcing them, and they're able to sort of ride this wave in a very thoughtful way, preparing for the hard times that are to come. And then I think, at the other end of the spectrum, you have, folks that have spent, a couple years at an Anduril, a Palantir, a SpaceX, that have maybe done a couple stints at startup. They've seen like capital relatively abundant in those periods of time. And it's easy to go out and raise, $5, $10, $15 million seed round. And they're just saying like, hey, let's do this. Let's, start a company. Let's hire 10, 15, 20 people and let's get our factory and let's go chase sort of the market. Let's, build a product maybe with a limited amount of sort of customer insight and sort of preempt that demand. And so that's a very risky strategy, right? You're sort of overbuilding in anticipation that the market will show up. Oftentimes anchored pretty heavily on government demand. And, that comes with its own sort of cyclical nature. And so yeah, I don't think those lessons are translating, very directly to a lot of new earlier founders where capital is easy and they've only sort of grown up and matured in a pretty capital rich environment. Brian, do you have any thoughts?
Interesting.
What are you seeing?
Oh my gosh. I have a lot of thoughts that are coming and going, trying to find the right moment here. But yeah, I mean, look at what you were saying too, Justice, about like, if you have the money available, are you not going to take the money while the money is available? I think the right answer is to take it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think what's really important for founders to be faced with, especially on the talent side, is like, how quickly can you grow while not over stressing your team on the actual hiring process, like where no one's working on the tech, they're only working on hiring, and where they can actually build and maintain the culture they want to build throughout massive like growth. And how do you keep the bar high even though you could hire a bunch of people? I think those three things can make it like, it's easy to say I'll hire 30 people tomorrow. It's another to look at those three things like right in their eyes, and like figure out what is like the actual rate of hiring that makes sense. Like, how do I fill the roles that actually matter the most, while also knowing that, hey, if a rock star comes along and I have the cash, I'm going to find something good for them to do. But also being dedicated enough to your culture and to progressing the tech forward, that you're not just lost only recruiting all day every day, because that can like really take away from the progress of the company. So those are some of the bigger things that I'm working with some of our clients and advising some of our clients on, and like how to do this really thoughtfully. Because at the end of the day, if your investors or your customers see that you have resources, they're going to want to see you also move proportionally fast to those resources, and I imagine, Justice, that you're seeing something similar. I'd be curious to your perspective. Like, yeah, investors are writing bigger checks. I imagine that comes with larger expectations. And if you have a bigger check, you kind of got to hire people and build hardware and go.
Yeah, I think the most direct example of that is a Series A, which typically had been, 5 to 15 million, required roughly $1 million in some sort of, government contracts or customer contracts or recurring revenue. That number is now 5x, 5 million, sort of the minimum bar. And in some cases, it's closer to 10. So yeah, that I think is the most direct translation of expectations. Now, a lot of companies aren't able to do that, and like the rate in which their customers are willing to move. So it's more, how do you build a thoughtful pipeline that could mature into those contracts in a reasonable amount of time? But that's sort of the art of the sale, right? Being able to articulate and convince people that there's enough there when it hasn't yet shown up. So
when I'm doing angel investing at like slightly later stages, like what I care the most about is like, okay, you had all these resources. What was your plan for those resources, and did you execute against those? And so I think it's just so important to be have such a clear and like clearly communicated plan to your investors of like what you're going to do with that money, and then execute against that, because that's what's going to make your next round better and better. And even if you said, I'm not going to spend all this money, I'm over raising, great. Well, did you still do what you said you were going to do? And I think that discipline is ultimately like what will help you raise those rounds, even when things might bust a little bit more than they are now.
I mean, that goes to we've talked about multiple times, the nature of building trust, doing what you're saying you're going to be able to do, and, following through, and important from a leadership or recruiting, and ultimately the investor relationships that you have. I think we'll tie it out there. We've covered a lot of interesting topics. I think, starting with the cyclical nature of venture and how that sort of flows through to different cultures and leadership environments where you're navigating the challenges and benefits of building in a scarce environment versus an abundant environment. And it's not really, you sort of play the hand that's dealt. And so, it's not really an option to sort of take. If you're going to build, you're going to take the larger check. You're going to build to abundance. So how do you not get too far out in front of your skis by, chasing, stuff that isn't real, hiring too much, getting caught in sort of the inflationary spiral and building to the value and making sure that you're sort of anticipating where the market's going to go. So you have a good foundation when we do shift back from abundance to scarcity. So this was fun, guys. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, Justice.